The night they wheeled my mother's body out of Riverside Memorial Hospital, I thought I understood what rock bottom felt like. It was November 15th, 1995, and the rain hammered against the hospital windows like bullets, each drop carrying away another piece of the life I'd known for 17 years. Mom had fought cervical cancer for 14 months, and I'd watched her shrink from the vibrant woman who used to dance to oldies in our kitchen to a skeletal stranger who could barely whisper my name. But as I stood in that sterile corridor, clutching her favorite silk scarf that still smelled like her jasmine perfume, I had no idea that losing her was just the appetizer to a nightmare I couldn't have imagined in my worst fever dreams. The main course would be served 3 days later by my Uncle Raymond, Dad's charming younger brother, who'd swooped into our grief like a vulture in a 3-piece suit. The man who'd bounced me on his knee when I was 5 would destroy what was left of my innocence in our living room while a thunderstorm raged outside, muffling my screams and washing away my childhood forever. And my father, the man who'd promised Mom he'd take care of me, would choose his brother's reputation over his daughter's truth, setting off a chain of events that would either destroy me completely or forge me into something unbreakable. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to burn down everything that's trying to kill you. What happened next would expose a predator who'd been hiding in plain sight for decades, uncover a pattern of abuse stretching back generations, and teach me that justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you take. But first, I had to survive long enough to fight back. My name is Caroline Elizabeth Harper, and before everything went to hell, I was your typical small-town overachiever living in Millfield, Georgia, population 4, 200, where everybody knows everybody's business, except when it really matters. I was 17, editor of the Millfield High newspaper, president of the debate team, and destined for journalism school at University of Georgia, with a full scholarship that Mom had been so proud of, she'd called everyone she knew, "My Carrie's going to change the world." She'd tell anyone who'd listen using the nickname only she was allowed to use. Mark my words, that girl's got fire in her belly and truth in her heart. Mom was Rebecca Harper, 39 years old, a 5th-grade teacher at Millfield Elementary who'd taught half the kids in town to read. She had auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight and a laugh that could fill our entire house. Even during chemo, when her hair fell out in chunks, she'd joke that she was going for the Sinead O'Connor look and make me laugh until my sides hurt. On her good days, we'd sit on our front porch swing, the one Dad built when they first got married, and she'd tell me stories about her own mother, how she'd survived the Depression by making magic out of scraps and hope out of heartbreak. "Remember Carrie?" She'd say, her voice getting weaker, but her eyes still fierce. "Life's going to knock you down more times than you can count, but it's not about staying down. It's about how you get back up. Every scar tells a story of survival, and every story matters." Those words would save my life later, though I didn't know it then. Dad was Thomas Harper, 42, a shift supervisor at the Millfield paper mill, who'd worked there since graduating high school. He was a man of few words but steady presence, the kind of father who showed love through actions rather than speeches. He'd taught me to change a tire balance a checkbook and throw a proper punch, just in case some boy doesn't understand the word no. After Mom's diagnosis, he worked double shifts to pay for treatments insurance wouldn't cover, coming home exhausted, but always asking about my day, always making sure I knew I wasn't alone. The night Mom died, I found him sitting in his old pickup truck in our driveway at 2 a.m., shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. When I knocked on the passenger window, he looked up with eyes so broken, I almost didn't recognize him. "I don't know how to do this without her, Carrie," he whispered, the first time he'd ever used Mom's nickname for me. His voice cracked on every word. "I don't know how to be both parents. Hell, I barely knew how to be one." "You don't have to be," I told him, climbing into the truck beside him and pulling his work jacket around my shoulders. "We'll figure it out together. Mom always said we were a team." We sat there until sunrise, sharing memories and making promises we both hoped we could keep. He promised He'd always protect me, always believe in me, always put me first. I promised I'd help hold our family together, no matter what came next. Your mama, she was the strong one, he said as the first light crept over the Georgia hills. But you've got her fire, Carrie. Don't ever let anyone put that out. Those promises would be tested in ways neither of us imagined. Then there was Uncle Raymond, Dad's younger brother by 3 years, though you'd never guess they were related. Where Dad was quiet and practical, Raymond was smooth and magnetic. He'd been the golden boy of the Harper family, the one who'd escaped Millfield for Atlanta, who drove a silver BMW and wore expensive suits, and always had stories about his latest business venture that never quite made sense when you tried to pin down the details. But there were other stories too, whispered fragments I'd caught over the years when adults thought children weren't listening. Once, when I was maybe 10, I'd overheard Grandma Harper talking to Mom in the kitchen, her voice tight with something that sounded like fear. That boy ain't right, Rebecca. Never has been. His daddy tried to beat it out of him, but some things... She trailed off, noticing me in the doorway. Little pitchers have big ears, she'd said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'd asked Mom about it later, but she'd just said Grandma was old and sometimes mixed up her stories. Now I wonder if Grandma had been trying to warn us about something she couldn't quite name, something dark that had been festering in our family tree for generations. Mom used to say Raymond could charm the scales off a snake. But there was something in her voice when she said it that suggested she wasn't entirely charmed. She'd watch him during family gatherings with a kind of guarded attention, the way you might watch a beautiful but venomous creature from a safe distance. Looking back, there were red flags scattered like breadcrumbs through my childhood memories of him. The way he'd insisted on giving me baths when I was little, claiming Dad didn't know how to wash a girl properly. How he'd show up at my school plays and track meets always with his camera, always taking more pictures than seemed necessary. The inappropriate comments about my development when I hit puberty, disguised as avuncular teasing, but accompanied by looks that made my skin crawl. Little Caroline's turning into quite the heartbreaker, he'd say at family dinners, his eyes lingering on my chest in ways that made me want to hide. Better keep an eye on her, Tommy. Girls like that can get into trouble if they're not properly supervised. But he was family, and in small southern towns, family loyalty trumped everything else. Even discomfort, even instinct, even truth. Our house on Magnolia Street was a 3-bedroom colonial that Dad had bought when he and Mom got married, painting it yellow because she said it looked like sunshine. After the funeral, it felt enormous and empty, every room echoing with memories of better times. I'd moved into Mom's old sewing room because I couldn't stand being across the hall from where she'd died, surrounded by medical equipment and the lingering smell of prescription drugs and approaching death. The town of Millfield nestled in a valley between rolling hills covered in pine and oak, the paper mill's smokestacks visible from anywhere in town, constantly reminding everyone where their livelihood came from. Main Street still had hitching posts from the 1800s, and the courthouse square featured a Confederate monument that sparked heated debates at town council meetings. It was the kind of place where secrets festered behind white picket fences and Sunday church smiles, where reputation mattered more than truth, and where a girl's word against a man's was worth about as much as Confederate currency. I should have seen it coming. Should have recognized the predator lurking behind Raymond's perfect smile and expensive suits. Should have trusted my instincts instead of family loyalty. But I was 17 and grieving, desperate for any comfort that might ease the crushing weight of loss. When Raymond offered to help around the house to be the support system Dad was too broken to provide, I was grateful instead of suspicious. That gratitude almost destroyed me. November 18th, 1995. 3 days after Mom's funeral, 4 days after I thought I'd experienced the worst pain possible. The date is burned into my memory like a brand, every detail preserved, with the sharp clarity trauma brings to moments that change everything forever. It was a Saturday evening, cold and drizzly, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and makes you want to curl up somewhere warm and safe. Dad had gone back to work that morning, not because he wanted to, but because grief doesn't pay bills, and the medical expenses had drained our savings account down to double digits. Raymond had called around noon ostensibly to check on Dad's shift schedule, but really to confirm what we both knew: I'd be alone in the house for at least 12 hours. "Don't you worry about our girl," Raymond had told Dad over the phone, his voice carrying that false warmth I'd learned to recognize but not yet understand. "I'll swing by and keep her company. Make sure she's not getting into any trouble while you're working so hard to keep food on the table." Our girl. The possessive phrase made something cold twist in my stomach, but I was too numb with grief to examine why. I was in the living room when he arrived, surrounded by sympathy cards and casserole dishes from neighbors trying to write thank you notes for the flowers and food that kept arriving. Mom would have insisted on proper gratitude, even in grief. Especially in grief. "Manners matter most when your heart is breaking," she used to say. "That's when people remember who you really are." The words kept blurring together on the page. "Thank you for your kindness during our difficult time," each one feeling more meaningless than the last. How do you thank someone for a tuna casserole when your entire world has collapsed? How do you express gratitude for flowers that will die just like everything else you love? Raymond let himself in without knocking, using the spare key Dad had given him after the funeral. He brought Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, expensive stuff, the kind with French words on the label that probably cost more than Dad made in a week. The wine should have been my first clue who brings alcohol to comfort a grieving teenager. But I was 17 and naive, still believing that family meant safety, that uncles were supposed to protect you from the monsters in the world, not become them. "How you holding up, sweet Caroline?" he asked, setting the food on our coffee table with theatrical concern. He'd changed out of his funeral suit into jeans and a polo shirt, casual in a way that seemed calculated to appear non-threatening. The cologne he wore was sharp and expensive, filling our small living room with a scent that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. "I'm okay," I lied, the automatic response I'd been giving everyone who asked. It was easier than explaining how every breath felt like drowning, how the silence in the house pressed against my ears like water, how I kept expecting to hear Mom's voice calling me from the kitchen. "Your mama would be proud of you," he said, settling onto the couch beside me, closer than necessary, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with something sharper, something medicinal that I'd later learn was the whiskey he'd been drinking to work up his courage. "She raised you right, teaching you proper manners and respect. Not like some of these wild girls running around town with no supervision." We ate in relative silence, Raymond making small talk about his business deals in Atlanta, something involving real estate investments that he explained in vague terms that never quite added up. I barely listened, picking at my lo mein, and thinking about Mom, about the scholarship letter that had arrived that morning, the one she'd never get to see, never get to frame and hang on the kitchen wall next to my school photos. "You know," Raymond said when I pushed my food around without eating, his voice taking on a different tone, something calculated and predatory that made my skin crawl. "Grief affects people in different ways. Some folks shut down completely, stop taking care of themselves. Others act out, make bad decisions they'll regret later." There was something in his eyes that made me look up from my plate, something calculating that hadn't been there before. "What do you mean?" "Just that you're at a vulnerable age dealing with adult emotions without proper guidance," he said, his gaze moving over my body in a way that made me want to cover myself with a blanket. "Sometimes, young women in your situation make poor choices, boys, drinking worse things. Your daddy's worried sick about you going off to college next year, all those temptations and no mama to guide you." The conversation felt like it was heading somewhere I didn't want to go, but I couldn't put my finger on why. My instincts were screaming warnings. I didn't know how to interpret alarm bells muffled by grief and the desperate need to believe that someone in my family still cared about me. "Dad knows I can take care of myself," I said, trying to inject some strength into my voice. "Does he?" Raymond's smile was different now, less avuncular and more predatory, like a wolf sizing up wounded prey. Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a little girl playing dress-up in her mama's clothes, pretending to be stronger than she really is." The words stung because they contained enough truth to hurt. I was pretending to be stronger than I felt, wearing Mom's confidence, like an ill-fitting costume that threatened to slip off at any moment. But something about the way he said it, the way his eyes moved over me as he spoke, made my skin crawl with a fear I couldn't name. "I think I should go to bed," I said, starting to gather the empty containers with hands that had begun to shake. "It's been a long day." "Now hold on," Raymond said, catching my wrist as I reached for his plate. His grip was firm, but not quite painful, a constraint disguised as concern. His fingers were cold against my skin, and I could feel his pulse beating against my palm like a trapped bird. "I drove all the way over here to spend time with you, and you're going to run off to your room like a child." "Let go of me," I said quietly, trying to pull away, but his grip only tightened. "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher correcting a slow student. "Your mama never taught you proper respect for your elders, did she? Maybe that's why she got sick divine punishment for raising a daughter who doesn't know her place." The blasphemy hit me like a physical blow, so shocking and cruel that for a moment I couldn't breathe. How dare he suggest Mom's cancer was punishment for anything? How dare he invoke God to justify whatever sick game he was playing? "Don't you dare talk about my mother that way," I snapped, jerking hard enough to break free from his grip, my voice finally finding some strength. "Get out of my house! Get out right now!" That's when his mask slipped completely. The concerned uncle disappeared, replaced by something cold and hungry and utterly without conscience. He stood up slowly, unfolding to his full height, and I realized for the first time how much bigger he was than me, 6'2", to my 5'4", probably 200 pounds of adult male strength against my barely 120-pound frame. "Your mother's not here to protect you anymore, Caroline," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "And your daddy's not coming home until tomorrow morning. It's just you and me, and it's time you learned what happens to little girls who don't show proper gratitude." I ran for the front door, panic flooding my system with adrenaline, but he was faster, catching me before I could reach the deadbolt. His hand clamped over my mouth, cutting off my scream, while his other arm wrapped around my waist like a python. The taste of his palm was salty and bitter, mixed with the chemical tang of whatever he'd been drinking before he arrived. "Nobody's going to hear you anyway." He breathed in my ear as he dragged me back toward the living room, his breath hot and sour against my neck. "This whole neighborhood's deaf as posts, and it's raining hard enough to drown out any noise you might make. Besides, who would believe you even if they heard poor little orphan girl making up stories for attention?" He was right about the rain. The November storm had picked up while we were eating thunder rolling across the Georgia hills, and lightning illuminating our windows in stark, violent flashes. Even if I could scream, even if someone heard me, they'd probably assume it was just the wind rattling the windows, or a tree branch scraping against the roof. What happened next exists in my memory as a series of disconnected snapshots, my mind fragmenting to protect itself from the full horror of the experience. His weight crushing me against Mom's antique sofa, the one she'd saved for months to buy because it reminded her of her grandmother's house. The sound of fabric tearing my clothes, but also something deeper, some fundamental part of me that would never quite heal. The smell of his cologne mixing with my own fear sweat, and the iron taste of blood where I'd bitten my tongue trying not to scream. Pain that felt like being torn apart from the inside, like my body was betraying me by breaking under his assault. The terrible intimacy of violation, the way he made my own flesh complicit in my destruction. But worse than the physical horror was the running commentary he provided throughout a steady stream of psychological cruelty designed to break my spirit as thoroughly as he was breaking my body. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" He panted in my ear, his voice thick with exertion and satisfaction. "Walking around in those tight jeans, flirting with every man who looks at you. You think I haven't noticed how you've been teasing me all these years? The way you'd sit on my lap at family dinners, wiggling around like a little whore? Your mama failed you didn't. She failed to teach you how to be a proper woman. Lucky for you, Uncle Raymond's here to finish your education. By the time I'm done with you, you'll know exactly what you're good for. Nobody's going to believe you if you try to tell. Who's going to take the word of a slutty teenager over a respectable businessman? Your daddy sure won't. He knows what kind of girl you really are. Deep down, he knows you asked for this." When it was over, he adjusted his clothes like nothing had happened, like he'd just finished watching television or reading the newspaper. I lay on the sofa in my torn clothes, bleeding and shaking, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself this was all a nightmare I'd wake up from. But the pain between my legs was real. The taste of blood in my mouth was real. The smell of his cologne lingering in the air was real. "Clean yourself up," he said casually, checking his watch like he had somewhere important to be. "Your daddy will be home in a few hours, and you don't want him seeing you like this. He's got enough problems without dealing with a hysterical daughter on top of everything else." He paused at the door, looking back with that same calculating smile, adjusting his collar with the casual arrogance of a man who'd just taken what he wanted and knew there would be no consequences. "Oh, and Caroline. This stays between us. Family business, you understand. Your daddy's already lost his wife. You really want to destroy what's left of his family over a little misunderstanding. Think about what that would do to him. Think about what people would say about you." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the rain and the pain and the terrible knowledge that my world had ended for the second time in 4 days. I lay there for what felt like hours, paralyzed by shock and trauma, before finally dragging myself to the bathroom. The girl in the mirror was a stranger, hollow-eyed and broken bruises already blooming on her throat and wrists like purple flowers. I showered until the hot water ran out, scrubbing my skin raw with Mom's loofah, but I couldn't wash away the feeling of his hands on me, his weight crushing the air from my lungs. When Dad came home at sunrise, I was sitting at the kitchen table in my bathrobe, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He looked exhausted, his work clothes stained with sweat and paper dust, his face gray with the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from trying to hold your life together when everything is falling apart. "How'd it go last night?" he asked, settling into his chair with a grateful sigh. "Raymond take good care of you." "Fine," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "He brought dinner and kept me company." "Good." Dad said, his relief so obvious it made my chest ache. "I was worried about leaving you alone so soon after, well, you know. It means a lot that Raymond's willing to help out. Family's all we got now, Carrie." Family. The word that would become a weapon used against me, a cage built out of loyalty and tradition, and the desperate need to believe that people we love are incapable of evil. If I'd told him right then in that kitchen where Mom used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, would things have been different? Would he have believed me, protected me, chosen his daughter over his brother? I'll never know, because I was 17 and traumatized and convinced that speaking the truth would destroy what was left of our shattered family. So I kept quiet, swallowing my pain like poison, and let Raymond get away with murder, the murder of the girl I used to be. For 2 weeks after the assault, I existed in a gray fog of denial and dissociation, moving through the world like a ghost haunting her own life. I went through the motions of normal existence, attending classes, completing homework, making appropriate responses when teachers asked how I was coping with my loss, but inside, I felt like I was drowning in slow motion, sinking deeper into an ocean of shame and silence with every passing day. The physical evidence of what Raymond had done faded gradually, my body healing itself with the cruel efficiency of youth. Bruises yellowed and disappeared. Scratches sealed themselves shut. The soreness between my legs became a memory instead of a constant reminder. But the psychological damage ran deeper than bone poisoning. Every interaction, every moment of supposed safety, every attempt to pretend that life could somehow continue as normal. Sleep became my enemy. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that sofa, feeling his weight, hearing his voice, tasting my own fear. I'd lie awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound in the house. The settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant rumble of trucks on the highway. Any noise could be him coming back. Any shadow could be his silhouette in the doorway. When exhaustion finally claimed me, I'd wake up screaming, covered in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal. Dad would come running, his own grief momentarily forgotten in the face of his daughter's obvious distress. Just nightmares about Mom. I'd tell him the lie, coming easier each time. I keep dreaming she's calling for me, but I can't find her. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did dream about Mom, but in my nightmares she was trying to warn me about something I couldn't understand, reaching for me with hands that turned to smoke before they could touch me. She'd mouth words I couldn't hear over the sound of Raymond's voice telling me I was a whore, that no one would believe me, that this was what I deserved. Dad would smooth my hair back like he used to when I was little, his touch gentle and paternal, and completely different from Raymond's grabbing hands. "She's at peace now, honey," he'd whisper. "The pain's over for her." If only it were over for me. My grades, which had been perfect since kindergarten, started slipping like water through a broken dam. I'd sit in American history, listening to Mrs. Patterson discuss the Civil War, but all I could think about was Raymond's hands on my body, his voice in my ear, the smell of his cologne mixing with my terror. The words on the blackboard might as well have been hieroglyphics for all the sense they made. I failed my first calculus test, then my second. When my English teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, asked if everything was okay at home, I just nodded and mumbled something about still adjusting to life without Mom. The lie felt like swallowing broken glass, but it was easier than explaining that my uncle had raped me and I was too much of a coward to tell anyone. The journalism scholarship that had seemed so important before Mom's death now felt meaningless, like a prize in a game I no longer knew how to play. How could I write about truth when I was living a lie? How could I investigate stories when I couldn't face my own, the newspaper office? Once my sanctuary became another place, I had to avoid another reminder of the person I used to be before Raymond destroyed her. My best friend, Jessica Martinez, noticed the change immediately. We'd been inseparable since third grade, sharing everything from childhood crushes to college dreams, planning our futures with the casual certainty of teenagers who believe the world will bend to their will. But now I couldn't bear to be around her, couldn't stand the way her concern made me feel even more broken and isolated. The Monday after Raymond's assault, she cornered me at my locker between classes, her dark eyes sharp with worry and frustration. "Okay, enough," she said, crossing her arms in the way that meant she wasn't taking no for an answer. "You look like death warmed over you. Haven't returned any of my calls, and you just walked past Brad Morrison without even noticing he said hi. What the hell is going on with you?" Brad Morrison was the senior class president I'd been crushing on since sophomore year, a sweet boy with kind eyes and a laugh that made my stomach flip. Under normal circumstances, getting his attention would have been the highlight of my week. But these weren't normal circumstances, and the thought of any male attention made my skin crawl with revulsion. "I'm fine," I said, automatically shoving textbooks into my locker with unnecessary force, hoping she couldn't see how my hands were shaking. "Just tired, haven't been sleeping well since Mom died." Jessica studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd known me for half my life, someone who could read my moods like weather patterns. "This is more than grief, Caroline. You're acting like someone who's been through something terrible. Did something happen at home? Is your dad drinking again? Dad had gone through a brief period of heavy drinking after his own father's death, something I'd only learned about years later. But Jessica remembered things like that, stored them away against future need. For a moment, I almost told her everything. The words were right there pressing against my teeth like caged birds, desperate for freedom. But how could I explain what Raymond had done without destroying my family's reputation, without confirming every ugly stereotype about teenage girls who cry rape for attention? How could I burden her with knowledge that would make her complicit in my silence? Nothing happened, I said firmly, slamming my locker shut with enough force to make nearby students turn and stare. I'm just having a hard time adjusting to life without Mom. Can we please drop it? Jessica didn't look convinced, but she knew when to push and when to give me space. It was one of the things I'd always loved about her. Her ability to read people, to know exactly what they needed, even when they couldn't say it themselves. Okay, she said quietly, her voice soft with hurt and confusion. But I'm here if you need to talk. About anything. You know that, right? I nodded, though we both knew I was lying. As I walked away, I could feel her watching me, probably trying to figure out what she'd done wrong, why her best friend had suddenly become a stranger. Another casualty of Raymond's war against my soul. Raymond didn't come around for those first 2 weeks, and I began to hope, with the desperate optimism of a drowning person, that maybe it had been a one-time thing, a moment of weakness he regretted as much as I did. Maybe the reality of what he'd done had shocked him back to his senses. Maybe he'd stay in Atlanta, focus on his mysterious business deals, and pretend our misunderstanding had never happened. I should have known better. Predators don't feel remorse, they feel ownership. He showed up on a Saturday afternoon when Dad was at Murphy's Hardware, spending his day off fixing the things around our house that grief had made him neglect. I was in the kitchen, making a sandwich, trying to force myself to eat something more substantial than the crackers and coffee that had become my primary diet when I heard his key in the front door. The sound of his voice behind me made me drop the knife I'd been using, the blade clattering against the linoleum floor with a sound like breaking bones. Hello, sweet Caroline. He said, his tone casual and friendly, as if nothing had changed between us, as if 2 weeks ago hadn't happened at all. How's my favorite niece doing? I spun around, pressing my back against the counter, trying to put as much distance between us as possible in the small kitchen. He looked exactly the same, expensive clothes, perfect hair, that practiced smile that had fooled everyone for so long. Only now, I could see the predator lurking beneath the mask, the calculating intelligence that had sized me up and found me wanting. What do you want? I asked, proud that my voice only shook a little, that I managed to get the words out at all. Can't a man check on his family without ulterior motives? He asked, moving closer, despite the warning in my posture, ignoring the way I pressed myself against the counter like a cornered animal. I've been worried about you, Caroline. You look thin, stressed. Your daddy mentioned you're having trouble sleeping. The fact that Dad had discussed my nightmares with Raymond felt like another violation, another boundary crossed without my consent. It meant they'd been talking about me, analyzing my behavior, deciding what was best for me, without bothering to ask what I needed. I'm fine. I said the lie automatic by now. Dad's just gone to the store, but he'll be back soon. Will he? Raymond consulted his watch with theatrical precision, the gesture of a man who had all the time in the world to do whatever he wanted. Because I saw him at Murphy's Hardware, and you know how old Murphy likes to talk. Could be an hour or more before Tommy makes it home. Plenty of time for us to catch up. Tommy. He called Dad by his childhood nickname, a reminder of their shared history, their brotherhood that trumped everything else, including me, including my safety, including my right to exist in my own home without fear. I want you to leave, I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by anger rather than fear. Get out of my house. Get out right now. His smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Amusement maybe, or the satisfaction of a hunter who'd successfully cornered his prey. Your house. Last I checked, this was your daddy's house, and he gave me a key, which makes me welcome here anytime I please. He was right, and we both knew it. In the hierarchy of family loyalty, an uncle's access trumped a daughter's comfort. Dad would never revoke Raymond's key based on my word alone, especially not when I couldn't tell him why I wanted Raymond banned from our home. Besides, Raymond continued settling into Mom's old chair at the kitchen table like he owned the place. We never finished our conversation from the other night. You ran off to bed so quickly I didn't get a chance to explain how things are going to work from now on. My blood turned to ice water, fear flooding my system so completely that for a moment I couldn't breathe. There's nothing to explain. What happened was a mistake, and it's never going to happen again. Oh, but you're wrong about that, he said, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher correcting a slow student. See, what happened between us wasn't a mistake. It was inevitable. You've been asking for it for years, walking around this house in your little shorts and tank tops, flirting and teasing like the cock tease you are. That's not true, I whispered, but even as I said it, doubt crept in like poison. Had I somehow encouraged this? Had my normal teenage behavior been interpreted as invitation? Was this somehow my fault? Of course it's true, Raymond said, standing up and moving toward me with predatory grace, backing me further into the corner between the counter and the refrigerator. And now that we've broken the ice, so to speak, things are going to be different between us. More honest, more intimate. I tried to run, but he caught my wrist before I could reach the kitchen door, his grip painful and inescapable. Where do you think you're going, sweet Caroline? We're just getting started. What followed was a repeat of that first night's horror. But worse, because now I knew what was coming, could anticipate each violation before it happened. He was more confident this time, more cruel his running commentary, designed to break down my resistance completely. This time, he seemed to enjoy my fear more than my body feeding off my terror, like a vampire feeding off blood. He took his time, savoring each moment of my helplessness, each proof of his complete control over my life. This is what you want, isn't it? He panted in my ear as he forced me down on the kitchen floor, the same floor where Mom used to dance while she cooked dinner. Why else would you be home alone dressed like that? You knew I was coming. You planned this. I was wearing jeans and a UGA sweatshirt, hardly provocative by any standard, but in Raymond's twisted logic, my mere existence was an invitation. My breathing was an invitation. My presence in my own home was an invitation. When it was over, he adjusted his clothes and checked his reflection in the toaster, smoothing his hair back into place with practiced ease, like he'd just finished a business meeting instead of committing a felony. Clean yourself up, he said, exactly as he had before. Your daddy will be home soon, and we don't want him worrying about his precious daughter. Do we? Please, I whispered, the word scraping my throat raw. Please don't do this anymore. I won't tell anyone what happened, I swear. Just please, leave me alone. He paused at the kitchen door, looking back with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold and calculating. Oh, sweetheart, you still don't understand. This isn't something you get to negotiate. This is your new reality. I'll be coming around whenever I please, and you'll be here waiting for me. Because if you're not... He pulled out his phone, swiping to a photo that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was me unconscious on the sofa. After that first assault, my clothes torn positioned in a way that looked deliberate rather than violent. The angle was calculated professional. He'd taken time to arrange my body like a photographer composing a shot. I've got pictures, Caroline, lots of them. And if you ever think about running your mouth to Daddy or anyone else, these photos are going to find their way to everyone in town. Your classmates, your teachers, the admissions committee at UGA. Everyone will see what a little whore Caroline Harper really is. The phone disappeared back into his pocket, taking my hope with it. Evidence of my shame, my violation twisted into proof of my supposed complicity. In 1995, before digital literacy and revenge porn laws, before society understood how predators use technology as weapons, those photos would have been accepted as evidence of my guilt rather than his crimes. "I'll be back next weekend," he said cheerfully, as if we'd just finished discussing the weather instead of my ongoing rape. "Make sure you're here, and Caroline. Try to look a little more enthusiastic next time. A man likes to feel wanted." The front door slammed behind him, leaving me alone with the afternoon silence and the terrible knowledge that this was my life now. Not a single incident I could survive and forget, but an ongoing nightmare with no foreseeable end. Dad came home an hour later, loaded down with paint samples and hardware store gossip, humming an old song Mom used to love. He found me in the kitchen scrubbing the floor with unnecessary intensity, trying to erase all evidence of Raymond's presence. "You okay, honey?" he asked, noting my red-rimmed eyes and shaky hands. "You look upset. Just thinking about Mom." I said the lie coming easier with practice. "Sometimes I smell her perfume in here and it hits me all over again that she's really gone." Dad's face crumpled with shared grief. His own pain so obvious that I almost told him everything right then. Almost. But the weight of Raymond's threats, the certainty that no one would believe me, kept the words locked in my throat. "I know, baby girl," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like sawdust and Old Spice. "I miss her too. But we've got each other, and we've got family, like Raymond, who care about us. We'll get through this together." Raymond, who cares about us. If Dad only knew how much his brother cared, how often he planned to demonstrate that care in the coming weeks and months. But I couldn't tell him, couldn't burden him with a truth that would destroy our family and confirm every doubt he'd ever had about his ability to protect me. So I smiled and nodded and helped him make dinner, playing the role of the grieving but resilient daughter, while inside, I was already starting to plan my escape from a prison built out of family loyalty and my uncle's sick desires. I just didn't know yet that escape would require becoming something I'd never imagined. I could be a predator, hunting my own predator. The pattern established itself over the following months like a malignant routine, a sick clockwork that governed my life with the precision of a metronome. Raymond would call Dad during the week, casual conversations about work and weather that always ended with seemingly innocent questions about my schedule. When would I be home alone? Was I having any more of those behavioral problems that grieving teenagers sometimes developed? Did Dad need him to come check on me while he worked overtime to pay off Mom's medical bills? Dad, grateful for his brother's support and oblivious to the predator lurking beneath Raymond's concerned facade, would provide all the information Raymond needed to plan his next assault. What time Dad left for work when he'd be home, whether I had any after-school activities that might interfere with Raymond's visits. "That brother of mine is a godsend," Dad would tell me, hanging up the phone with obvious relief. "I don't know what we'd do without him." If only he knew. The visits followed a predictable pattern that made them somehow worse than random attacks. Raymond would arrive with some excuse, bringing groceries, checking on repairs the house needed, wanting to spend quality time with his niece. He'd make small talk until he was certain we were alone, then drop the mask of concerned uncle and reveal the monster underneath. But it was the escalation that broke me, the way each assault became more violent, more degrading than the last. What had started as a single horrific violation became a systematic campaign to destroy not just my body, but my spirit, my sense of self, my belief that I deserved to exist without pain. The second assault in December was accompanied by his first gift, a gold necklace with a small pearl pendant that he fastened around my throat while I lay broken on the living room carpet. "This belonged to my grandmother," he whispered in my ear, his breath hot and sour. "She always said it should go to a special girl in the family, someone who understood her place, who knew how to be grateful." When I tried to refuse it, tried to push it away, he grabbed my face with bruising force. "You'll wear it?" he said, his voice calm, but his eyes dead and cold. "And every time you look in the mirror, you'll remember who you belong to now." The third assault came in January during a blizzard that trapped us in the house for 3 days. This time, he brought a camera. Smile, sweet Caroline, he said, positioning me like a photographer arranging a model. These are for my private collection. Something to remember our special times together. I tried to cover my face to hide from the lens, but he was stronger. Always stronger. You took the necklace, didn't you? He whispered during the February assault, his breath hot against my ear as he pinned me against my bedroom wall. Wore it to school, showed it off to your little friends. That makes this a transaction sweet, Caroline. You're getting paid for services rendered. The jewelry sat in my dresser drawer like poisoned fruit, too expensive to throw away, but too tainted to wear. Everything he gave me became evidence of my supposed complicity, twisted proof that I was a willing participant rather than a victim. But it was the psychological warfare that nearly destroyed me completely. Each assault was accompanied by increasingly sophisticated manipulation designed to convince me that I was complicit in my own violation. Your mama knew, he told me during the March assault, his words hitting like physical blows. Why do you think she never left us alone together when you were little? She could see what kind of girl you were going to become. What kind of girl you already were? That's not true, I whispered, but doubt crept in like poison. Had Mom suspected something? Was that why she'd sometimes seemed tense around Raymond? Why she'd never quite trusted him the way Dad did? Of course, it's true. Raymond said, his voice taking on that patient teacher-like tone that made my skin crawl. She tried to protect you from yourself, but cancer got her before she could finish the job. Lucky for you, Uncle Raymond's here to complete your education. My grades continued their downward spiral despite my desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I'd sit in class trying to focus on algebra or American history, but all I could think about was the next assault, the next violation, the next time I'd have to pretend that everything was fine while Raymond tore apart what was left of my soul. The full scholarship to UGA, Mom's dream for my future, slipped away as my GPA dropped below the required threshold. When the rejection letter arrived in March, I hid it under my mattress and told Dad the university was still reviewing applications. They'd be crazy not to take you, he said, ruffling my hair with the casual affection of a father who still believed his daughter was the same girl she'd been before his brother destroyed her. Your mama would be so proud. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was easier than explaining that I was failing everything, that I couldn't concentrate, that the girl who'd once dreamed of changing the world through journalism now couldn't even write a coherent paragraph about the Civil War. Jessica Martinez staged an intervention in the school parking lot one cold February afternoon, blocking my path to the car with the determination of someone who'd watched her best friend disappear for too long. Okay, enough, she said, her breath visible in the winter air. I've given you space, I've respected your privacy, but this has gone too far. You're failing classes, you never hang out anymore, and you look like you haven't slept in months. Something is seriously wrong, and I'm not leaving until you tell me what it is. I stared at her across the hood of my beat-up Honda. My best friend since childhood, the girl who'd shared every secret, every dream, every fear. She deserved the truth, but the truth would destroy both of us. How could I tell her that my uncle was attacking me regularly? How could I burden her with knowledge that would make her complicit in my silence? More than that, how could I admit that I was too weak, too broken, too pathetic to fight back? How could I confess that I just lay there and let it happen, that I'd become the whore Raymond said I was? It's just grief, Jess. I said, the lie tasting like bile in my mouth. Everyone processes loss differently. Some people cry and get sympathy. Others just shut down. This isn't shutting down, she said, her voice sharp with frustration and fear. This is self-destruction. Caroline, if someone is hurting you, nobody's hurting me. I snapped, the denial automatic and vehement. God, Why does everyone think something dramatic has to be happening? Can't a person just be sad without it being some big mystery? Jessica flinched at my tone, hurt flashing across her face like I'd slapped her. I'm trying to help you. I don't need help, I said, getting into my car and starting the engine with hands that shook like autumn leaves. I need people to leave me alone and let me grieve in peace. I drove away without looking back, leaving my best friend standing in the parking lot with tears in her eyes. Another relationship sacrificed on the altar of Raymond's secret, another connection severed to protect the fiction that everything was fine. The breaking point came in early April during what I didn't know would be my final assault as a victim. Raymond had arrived on a Saturday afternoon, timing his visit perfectly with Dad's shift at the paper mill. But this time, something was different. He was more aggressive, more violent, more determined to break whatever resistance I had left. You're getting too comfortable with this arrangement, he snarled, forcing me down on the living room carpet with a violence that left bruises on my wrists and shoulders. Starting to think you can just lie there like a dead fish and wait for it to be over. Time to teach you some enthusiasm. What followed was the worst assault yet, not just physically, but psychologically. He forced me to participate in ways that made me feel complicit, that turned my survival responses into evidence of my supposed enjoyment. He made me say things, do things, become things that I knew would haunt my nightmares forever. When it was over, I lay on the carpet bleeding and broken, staring at the ceiling, and finally understanding with crystal clarity that this would never end unless I made it end. Much better, Raymond said, adjusting his clothes with satisfaction. See what happens when you apply yourself. Next time I expect that kind of enthusiasm from the start. He left me there, like discarded trash, broken and bleeding on the carpet where Mom used to play with me when I was little. But something had shifted during that final assault. Some internal switch flipped from victim to survivor. As I lay there in my own blood, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to fight back, but first I had to learn how to become a predator myself. The first step was documentation. I started keeping a detailed journal hidden in a hollowed-out copy of Jane Eyre that Raymond would never think to examine. I recorded every assault, dates, times, exact words spoken, physical evidence left behind. I saved the gifts he'd given me, no longer seeing them as proof of my complicity, but as evidence of his manipulation. I took photos of bruises and injuries using the Polaroid camera Mom had given me for my 16th birthday. But it was harder than I'd expected. There were nights when I'd sit with my pen poised over the page, unable to write a single word, because admitting what had happened made it real in a way that silence didn't. There were times when I'd start to document an assault and have to run to the bathroom to vomit my body, rejecting the memories as surely as it had rejected his touch. I failed more times than I succeeded in those early weeks. I'd planned to take photographs of injuries, then forget in the aftermath of trauma. I'd mean to hide evidence, then panic and throw it away, terrified that someone would find it and know my shame. I was 17 and traumatized and learning to be a detective while my world collapsed around me. But I kept trying because the alternative was lying down and dying, and something deep inside me, some stubborn spark that Raymond hadn't been able to extinguish, refused to let him win. The second step was research. I spent hours in the public library reading everything I could find about sexual assault, legal procedures, evidence collection. I learned about rape kits and chain of custody and the statistics that explained why so few cases ever made it to trial. I discovered that in Georgia in 1996, a victim's word against her attackers was rarely enough for conviction, especially when the attacker was a respected member of the community and the victim was a teenage girl. But I also learned about other cases, other survivors who'd found ways to get justice despite the odds. Women who'd built cases through patience and planning, who'd gathered evidence systematically and waited for the right moment to strike. I studied their strategies like a general preparing for war, because that's what this was, a war for my freedom, my future, my very soul. The third step was preparation. I researched Georgia's laws about recording conversations without consent illegal in most circumstances, but with exceptions for situations involving ongoing criminal activity. I saved money from my part-time job at the local bookstore, accumulating a small fund for legal fees or escape if necessary. I identified adults who might believe me if I came forward: teachers, counselors, police officers who had reputations for taking assault cases seriously. Most importantly, I began planning Raymond's downfall with the cold calculation of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required becoming the monster you were fighting. He'd taught me well about manipulation and deception, about using people's assumptions against them. Now, I was going to turn those lessons against him. But the psychological toll was enormous. Some nights I'd lie awake planning his destruction and feel sick with myself, wondering if the desire for revenge was turning me into something as twisted as he was. Other nights, I'd be paralyzed by fear, convinced that he somehow knew what I was planning, that he'd escalate his violence before I could gather enough evidence to stop him. There were moments when I almost gave up entirely. Once in late April, I found myself standing at the edge of Miller's Bridge, looking down at the dark water of the Chattahoochee River and wondering if drowning would hurt less than living. It was only the thought of the other girls Raymond had mentioned, the cousins I'd never met, the victims whose stories he'd used to torment me, that pulled me back from the edge. If I died, who would speak for them? If I gave up, who would stop him from finding his next victim? By May 1996, 6 months after that first assault, I was as ready as I'd ever be to end this nightmare permanently. I just needed the right opportunity, the perfect moment when Raymond's arrogance would provide the evidence I needed to destroy him completely. That opportunity came sooner than I expected, delivered gift-wrapped by Raymond's own escalating confidence that he was untouchable. He had no idea that the broken girl he'd been systematically destroying had learned to hunt. May 18th, 1996. The date when everything changed, when victim became predator and the hunted became the hunter. I've memorized every detail of that day: the smell of honeysuckle drifting through my bedroom window, the sound of mockingbirds in the oak tree outside, the way the afternoon light slanted across my desk, where I'd been pretending to do homework while actually planning Raymond's destruction. He'd called that morning ostensibly to check on Dad's plans for the weekend, but really to confirm that I'd be alone Saturday evening. Dad was working another double shift at the mill, trying to scrape together enough money for the property taxes that were due at the end of the month. "I'll swing by around 7. Raymond told Dad over the phone, his voice carrying that false warmth I'd learned to recognize as the precursor to violence. "Make sure our girl's not getting into any trouble while you're working so hard to keep food on the table." Our girl. The possessive phrase made my skin crawl, but this time it also sparked something else, a cold, calculating fury that I'd been nurturing for weeks. Tonight, Raymond would finally pay for what he'd done to me. Tonight, I would become the hunter instead of the prey. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, setting the stage for Raymond's final performance. The microcassette recorder borrowed from the school journalism department under the pretense of conducting interviews for the student newspaper was taped to my ribs, hidden beneath a loose sweater. I'd tested it repeatedly, ensuring the microphone could pick up conversation from across the room, and that the 90-minute tape would be sufficient for whatever Raymond had planned. More importantly, I'd prepared myself psychologically for what was about to happen. This wouldn't be another assault I passively endured. This would be my conscious choice to sacrifice my body one final time in service of gathering evidence that would destroy him forever. The distinction was crucial. Tonight, I wasn't a victim. I was an investigator, a warrior, a predator, hunting my own predator. But as 7 o'clock approached, doubt crept in like poison. What if the recorder malfunctioned? What if Raymond suspected something? What if I couldn't go through with it, couldn't endure another assault, even for the sake of justice? My hands were shaking as I checked the recorder one final time, making sure the tape was properly positioned, that the microphone was clear, that the battery indicator showed full power. Everything had to be perfect. I wouldn't get another chance. Raymond arrived precisely at 7 punctual, as always in his cruelty. He'd brought wine again, expensive stuff from his mysterious business dealings, and Chinese food from the same restaurant where he'd bought dinner that first night. The symmetry was probably intentional, his way of marking anniversaries in our sick relationship. "Evening, sweet Caroline," he said, letting himself in without knocking. "How's my favorite niece tonight?" "I'm fine." I replied, the words automatic after months of practice. But tonight, they carried a different weight. Tonight, I actually was fine, calm, focused, ready for battle. He set up dinner on the coffee table with familiar ritual, pouring wine into glasses Mom had received as a wedding gift. The irony wasn't lost on me, using symbols of her marriage to facilitate the ongoing violation of her daughter. But I accepted the glass without protest, even took a small sip to avoid suspicion. I needed Raymond relaxed and confident, convinced that I'd accepted my role in his twisted family dynamic. He said, settling onto the couch beside me. "I've been thinking about your future lately. College, career plans, that sort of thing. Your daddy mentioned you didn't get that scholarship to UGA." The casual mention of my destroyed dreams was like a knife between my ribs, but I kept my expression neutral. There were other qualified candidates. "Of course there were," Raymond said, his tone dripping false sympathy. "Competition's fierce these days. But don't you worry, Uncle Raymond's got connections. I could make some calls, pull some strings. Get you into a nice school where you could study something practical. Business, maybe? Or hospitality management?" Hospitality management? The euphemism was so transparent, it was almost funny. He wanted to train me for a career in service to him, to other men, like him, to anyone with enough money and power to demand compliance. "That's very generous," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure college is right for me anymore. Maybe I should just get a job, help Dad with the bills." "Nonsense," Raymond said, his hand finding my knee with practiced familiarity. "A girl with your talents shouldn't waste them in some dead-end job. You've got potential, Caroline. You just need the right guidance to reach it." His hand moved higher up my thigh, and I forced myself not to flinch. The recorder was running, capturing every word, every casual admission of his plans for my future. But I needed more than innuendo and suggestion. I needed him to confess explicitly to what he'd been doing. "Raymond," I said, using his first name instead of uncle for the first time since childhood. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. You can ask me anything." That first night after Mom's funeral, did you plan it? Or did it just happen? The question caught him off guard, wine glass halfway to his lips. His eyes sharpened, suddenly alert to the possibility of a trap. For a moment, I thought I'd overplayed, my hand pushed too hard, too fast. "What kind of question is that?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about it a lot," I said, leaning into him slightly, letting my voice take on a softer, more intimate tone that made me want to vomit. "About us, about what we have together. I just want to understand how it started." The flattery worked exactly as I'd hoped. Raymond's suspicion melted into smug satisfaction, his ego unable to resist the opportunity to explain his own cleverness. In that moment, I understood something crucial about predators. They don't just want to hurt you. They want you to admire them for it. "Ha, smart girl," he murmured, his hand resuming its exploration of my body. "Always asking the right questions. That's what's going to make you successful in life." He took a long pull from his wine glass, settling back into the couch cushions with the relaxed posture of a man completely in control of his environment. The alcohol was working in my favor, loosening his tongue and his inhibitions. "To answer your question," he said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he used when explaining his business deals. "It was inevitable from the moment your mama got sick. I saw how broken your daddy was, how lost you were, and I knew someone had to step up and take charge of the situation. Take charge how? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. By teaching you what you needed to know about being a woman. He said, his hand now openly groping me through my clothes. Your mama was too soft, too naive. She would have sent you off to college a virgin, completely unprepared for the real world. Men would have eaten you alive. The recorder was getting everything: his admission of premeditation, his justification for grooming and assault, his complete lack of remorse or recognition that he'd committed crimes. But I needed more. I needed him to be explicit, to use words that no defense attorney could twist or explain away. So you were protecting me? I asked, the words like poison in my mouth. Exactly, Raymond said, pulling me closer with rough hands. I was protecting you from men who would have used you and thrown you away. At least with me, you're learning proper techniques, proper gratitude. You're becoming the kind of woman who can take care of herself in any situation. And the gifts, the jewelry, the clothes? Payment for services rendered? He said bluntly, any pretense of affection dropping away. I'm not a monster, Caroline. I believe in fair compensation for good work. The better you perform, the better I treat you. Simple business transaction. There it was, the explicit admission I'd been waiting for. He'd just confessed on tape to months of sexual assault, to deliberately targeting me during my grief, to using gifts to create the illusion of my complicity. Any competent prosecutor would be able to use this recording to build an airtight case. But Raymond wasn't finished. Wine and arrogance had loosened his tongue beyond even my expectations, and he was about to reveal something that would change everything I thought I understood about his crimes. You know, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, you're not the first niece I've had to educate. Your cousin Sarah in Alabama needed similar guidance when her mama died a few years back. Sweet little thing, just like you. And there was Jennifer in Tennessee and little Michelle in Florida. My blood turned to ice water, but I forced myself to remain calm to keep the conversation going. How many? Raymond's smile was cold and proud, the expression of a collector displaying his most prized possessions. Oh, 6 or 7 over the years. Maybe more, I lose track sometimes. But they were all Harper girls, all family. It's important to keep these lessons in the bloodline, you understand. Tradition. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, but it also crystallized my resolve. This wasn't just about my own survival anymore. It was about stopping him before he found an 8th victim, a 9th, a 10th. Every day Raymond remained free was another day. Some other girl might suffer what I'd suffered. But there was something else in his tone. Something that made my investigative instincts prickle with suspicion. He wasn't just bragging about his crimes. He was hinting at something deeper, something that connected all these assaults in ways I didn't yet understand. Tradition, I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Family tradition. Raymond said, his eyes taking on a faraway look that was somehow more frightening than his predatory stare. The Harper men have always known how to handle their women. My daddy taught me just like his daddy taught him. It's how we maintain order, how we keep the family strong. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Raymond wasn't just a predator. He was part of a cycle, a pattern of abuse that stretched back through generations of Harper men. He'd been victimized himself, then turned into a victimizer, perpetuating a sick legacy that probably went back decades. Your father, I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. I started when I was about your age, Raymond said casually, as if discussing the weather. Maybe a little younger. Tommy too, though he never talks about it. Always was the weak one, couldn't handle what needed to be done. That's why I had to step up, take responsibility for the family's future. Dad. Raymond was talking about Dad, about both of them being abused by their own father. The implications were staggering, not just for my understanding of Raymond's crimes, but for everything I thought I knew about my own family. That's fascinating. I managed, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. I had no idea our family was so close.
Family takes care of family.
Raymond said, echoing the phrase Dad had used so many times, though now it carried a completely different meaning.
The strong protect the weak, teach them their place in the natural order. It's how we've survived for generations.
I wanted to ask more questions to dig deeper into this revelation, but Raymond was already moving on his hands, becoming more aggressive, his breathing heavier. The confession portion of the evening was over. Now came the part I'd been dreading, the final assault I'd have to endure to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. What followed was the most difficult 90 minutes of my life, enduring one final violation while keeping the recorder running and my mind focused on the evidence I was gathering. Every touch, every degradation, every moment of pain was being preserved for posterity, building an unassailable case against a predator who thought himself untouchable. But now I understood that Raymond was more than just my abuser. He was the product of a systematic pattern of abuse that had infected my family for generations. And that knowledge, terrible as it was, gave me something I'd never had before: context. A way to understand not just what had happened to me, but why. When it was over, Raymond dressed with his usual casual arrogance, checking his watch and complaining about traffic back to Atlanta.
Same time next weekend, he said, pocketing his car keys.
And Caroline, think about what I said about college. I've got some ideas for your future that I think you'll find very educational. The door closed behind him, leaving me alone with the silence and the weight of what I'd just accomplished. The recorder had captured everything: confessions to multiple assaults, admissions of a systematic pattern of abuse, explicit descriptions of crimes that could put him away for decades. But more than that, I'd captured evidence of something larger and more horrifying than I'd ever imagined. Raymond wasn't just my abuser. He was part of a cycle of violence that had been destroying Harper women for generations. And that cycle was about to end with me. As I sat in that living room, still shaking from the assault, but burning with purpose, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I wasn't just going to turn this evidence over to the police. I was going to make sure Raymond faced justice for every single crime he'd committed against every single girl he'd destroyed. And maybe, just maybe, I was going to find a way to break the cycle of abuse that had poisoned my family tree for far too long. The hunt was about to begin, and this time I had all the advantages. The recording was everything I'd hoped for, and more: 90 minutes of clear, unambiguous evidence that would destroy Raymond's carefully constructed facade and expose him as the serial predator he truly was. But as I sat in my bedroom at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, listening to his confession through headphones while Dad slept in the next room, I realized that gathering evidence was only the first battle in a war I was still learning how to fight. The sound of his voice admitting to years of assault, describing his victims like trophies in a collection, made me physically sick. But it was the revelation about my father that truly shattered me. Raymond's casual mention of their shared childhood trauma explained so much: Dad's silence, his retreat into work and avoidance, his desperate need to believe that his brother was a good man who'd never hurt anyone. Dad hadn't chosen Raymond over me because he didn't love me. He'd chosen silence because acknowledging Raymond's crimes would mean confronting his own buried trauma, his own victimization at the hands of their father. In his mind, protecting Raymond meant protecting himself from memories too painful to examine. But understanding didn't equal forgiveness. Dad's trauma didn't excuse his failure to protect me, his willingness to sacrifice his daughter's safety for his own psychological comfort. If anything, knowing what Raymond was capable of should have made him more vigilant, not less. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I called in sick to school and drove to the Millfield Police Department, a small brick building that served our town and 3 surrounding counties. The desk sergeant,
a heavy-set man named Officer Williams, who'd known my family for years, looked surprised to see me walk through the front door carrying a manila envelope like it contained nuclear secrets. "Hartem, Caroline Harper," he said with the forced cheerfulness adults use when they're not sure how to talk to grieving teenagers. "How you doing, honey? How's your daddy holding up?" "I need to report a crime," I said, bypassing the small talk that would normally be expected. "A serious crime. Sexual assault." The change in Officer Williams' demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The friendly familiarity disappeared, replaced by the careful professional distance law enforcement maintains when dealing with explosive allegations. I could see him calculating 17-year-old girl, recently orphaned, making serious accusations. How much of this was real trauma, and how much was teenage drama? "I see," he said, reaching for a notepad with obvious reluctance. "When did this alleged assault occur?" "It's been ongoing for 6 months," I replied, setting the envelope on his desk with steady hands. "Multiple assaults, multiple victims across multiple states. I have recorded evidence." Officer Williams' pen stopped moving. He stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to reconcile the composed young woman in front of him with whatever preconceptions he had about assault victims. In movies, victims were hysterical, broken, barely functional. They didn't walk into police stations with evidence and clear-eyed determination. "Who's the alleged perpetrator?" he asked finally. "My uncle Raymond Harper." The words hung in the air like a detonated bomb. Officer Williams's expression shifted from professional skepticism to something that looked uncomfortably like panic. Raymond Harper wasn't just any citizen, he was Thomas Harper's brother, a successful businessman from Atlanta, a man who'd been nothing but helpful to a grieving family. Accusing him of sexual assault was like accusing the mayor of embezzlement. "Raymond Harper," he repeated slowly. "Tommy's brother, the businessman from Atlanta who's been helping y'all out since your mama passed." "Yes, and you're alleging that there were multiple incidents of sexual assault." I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice, the subtle shift from taking a report to investigating whether I was lying. It was exactly what I'd expected, exactly what Raymond had warned me would happen. "I'm not alleging anything," I said, firmly pulling the cassette tape from my envelope. "I'm reporting documented crimes. Would you like to hear the evidence, or should I drive to the county seat and file the report there?" The threat of going over his head got Officer Williams moving. He made a phone call, spoke in low tones for several minutes, then hung up and told me to wait. 20 minutes later, Detective Lisa Chen walked through the door. Detective Chen was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who'd transferred to Millfield from Atlanta the previous year, bringing big city experience to small-town problems. She had a reputation for taking assault cases seriously, which made her unpopular with some of the old boys' network, but gave me hope that someone might actually listen to my story. "Caroline," she said, settling into the interview room with a legal pad and tape recorder, "I want you to know that I take these allegations very seriously, and I want you to feel comfortable telling me everything that happened." "I appreciate that," I said, "but before I say anything else, I think you should listen to this." I placed the microcassette on the table between us, along with a typed transcript I'd spent all of Sunday creating. Detective Chen raised an eyebrow, but picked up the tape and inserted it into her recorder. For the next 90 minutes, we sat in that sterile interview room listening to Raymond condemn himself in his own words. His confession to assaulting me repeatedly, his casual admission of targeting other family members, his explicit description of using gifts to create the illusion of my complicity, it was all there preserved in crystal clear audio that no defense attorney could explain away. When the tape ended, the room was silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Detective Chen stared at the recorder, like it might explode her face, cycling through disbelief, anger, and what I hoped was determination. "Jesus Christ!" she whispered, forgetting professional protocol for a moment. "Caroline, this is one of the most comprehensive pieces of evidence I've ever heard in an assault case. How did you know to document everything so thoroughly?" I'm the editor of the school newspaper, I replied. I understand the importance of evidence. I also understand that without proof, this would be my word against his, and in a town like Millfield, that's not a fight I could win. Detective Chen nodded grimly. You're absolutely right about that. Sexual assault cases are difficult to prosecute under the best circumstances, and when the accused is a respected member of the community with no prior record. But this changes things, right? I asked. I mean, he confessed, on tape, to multiple felonies. It absolutely changes things, Detective Chen said, her voice gaining strength and conviction. With evidence like this, we can build a case that's virtually bulletproof. The question is, are you prepared for what happens next? She explained the process: formal statements, medical examinations, interviews with family members who might corroborate my story or provide character testimony. She warned me about the media attention that would follow the way a small town would divide into camps of supporters and skeptics. Most importantly, she explained that pressing charges would mean facing Raymond in court, enduring cross-examination by defense attorneys who would try to paint me as an attention-seeking teenager with a grudge against her family. I understand all of that, I said. But Detective Chen Raymond told me about other victims, girls in Alabama, Tennessee, Florida. If I don't come forward, if I don't stop him, he's going to keep doing this to other children. That was the moment Detective Chen truly understood what we were dealing with. This wasn't just a local assault case. This was a serial predator who'd been operating across state lines for years, possibly decades. The implications were staggering, both for the investigation and for the victims who'd been suffering in silence while Raymond perfected his techniques of manipulation and control. Caroline. Detective Chen said carefully, "If what you're telling me is true, if there really are other victims in other states, this case is going to get very big very quickly. The FBI will get involved, media attention will be intense, and your life is going to change in ways you can't imagine. Are you absolutely certain you're ready for that?" I thought about Mom, about the promises she'd made me make before she died. Be brave, Carrie. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I thought about the unknown girls Raymond had mentioned, children who'd suffered what I'd suffered with no one to speak for them, no one to seek justice on their behalf. I'm ready, I said. But I wasn't ready for what came next. The call came that afternoon while I was sitting in Detective Chen's office, giving my formal statement for the third time. Dad's supervisor at the paper mill letting us know that Thomas Harper had collapsed during his shift and been rushed to Millfield General Hospital. Heart attack, Detective Chen explained after she hung up. Brought on by stress, according to the paramedics. Caroline, I think someone told your father about the investigation? My blood turned to ice. The investigation was supposed to be confidential, at least until we could arrest Raymond and search his properties for additional evidence. But in a small town like Millfield, secrets had a way of spreading like wildfire, especially secrets involving prominent families. We rushed to the hospital where I found Dad in the cardiac unit, hooked up to machines that monitored his vital signs with electronic precision. He looked older than his 42 years, gray and fragile in the harsh fluorescent light. Carrie, he whispered when he saw me, his voice barely audible over the beeping of monitors. They told me about Raymond, about what you're saying he did. Dad, is it true? He asked, his eyes searching my face for answers he probably didn't want to find. Did my brother really? I could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the desperate need to believe that his brother was innocent, battling against the evidence of his daughter's trauma. The slow recognition that his failure to protect me had nearly destroyed us both. Yes, I said simply. It's true. Dad closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners as his body shook with silent sobs. For several minutes, the only sounds in the room were the electronic rhythm of medical equipment and my father's broken breathing. I'm sorry, he finally whispered. God help me, Carrie. I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. Should have known.
After what happened to me and Raymond when we were kids, I should have been watching for the signs. You couldn't have known, I said, though part of me disagreed. He should have known. He should have protected me. But seeing him broken and hospitalized, finally confronting the trauma he'd buried for decades, I found forgiveness easier than I'd expected. He told me you were having problems, Dad continued, his voice gaining strength. Said you were acting out, making up stories for attention, and I believed him because it was easier than believing the alternative. Because believing you would mean admitting that our family was poison, that the curse had passed to another generation. The curse. He was talking about the cycle of abuse Raymond had described, the pattern of victimization that had been passed down through Harper men like a genetic disease. In Dad's mind, acknowledging Raymond's crimes would mean acknowledging his own victimization, and he wasn't strong enough to do that until his daughter's courage forced his hand. Dad, I said, taking his hand in mine, the curse ends with me. Raymond is never going to hurt another child, and you're never going to have to choose between protecting your brother and protecting your daughter again. That evening, Detective Chen called with news that changed everything. We've got a problem, Caroline. Your uncle isn't at his apartment in Atlanta, and his landlord says he cleared out sometime yesterday. Took everything and didn't leave a forwarding address. The revelation hit me like ice water. Raymond was gone, had probably been planning his escape for days or weeks. But how had he known about the investigation? The circle of people who knew about my accusations was small Detective Chen, Officer Williams, a few federal agents who'd been brought in to handle the multi-jurisdictional aspects of the case. Duh, someone warned him. Detective Chen continued, her voice tight with frustration. Someone with access to information about our investigation tipped him off, gave him time to cover his tracks, and disappear. The betrayal was almost as devastating as the original assault. Someone in law enforcement, someone who was supposed to protect victims and pursue justice, had chosen to protect a predator instead. Raymond's claim about having friends in the police department suddenly seemed less like boasting and more like statement of fact. What happens now? I asked. Now we issue a federal warrant and hope he's stupid enough to use credit cards or contact someone we can trace. Detective Chen replied. But I have to be honest with you, Caroline. Men like your uncle don't usually run unless they have a plan. He could be anywhere by now, and finding him could take months or years. The next few weeks passed in a blur of frustration and fear. Federal agents interviewed me repeatedly, trying to build a profile of Raymond's habits and contacts that might help them track him down. They contacted law enforcement agencies in Alabama, Tennessee, and Florida, sharing Raymond's confession and asking them to investigate unsolved assault cases involving young female relatives of Harper family members. But the results were disappointing. Either Raymond had been lying about his other victims to impress me with his criminal prowess, or those girls had been so thoroughly terrorized and manipulated that they still couldn't speak the truth years later. Dad recovered from his heart attack, but something fundamental had changed in him. The man who'd spent decades avoiding difficult truths was suddenly determined to confront every dark secret our family had ever buried. He started going to therapy, began talking about his own childhood trauma for the first time in his adult life, and threw himself into supporting my quest for justice with the fervor of someone seeking redemption. I failed you once, he told me during one of our long talks in his hospital room. I won't fail you again. Whatever it takes to find Raymond and make him pay for what he did, I'll do it. But weeks turned into months, and Raymond remained, a ghost vanished into the vast anonymity of America, with nothing but a recorded confession to prove he'd ever existed. The investigation stalled, media attention faded, and I began to wonder if justice was nothing more than a fairy tale adults told children to help them sleep at night. That's when Detective Chen called with news that would change everything one final time. We found him, she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Caroline, we found Raymond, and this time we have enough evidence to make sure he never hurts anyone again. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September, jarring me awake from the first decent sleep I'd had in weeks. Detective Chen's voice was tight with controlled excitement, and something else, relief maybe, or vindication.
We found him, Caroline. We found Raymond, and we're moving in within the hour.
I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. After 4 months of false leads and dead ends, after 4 months of living with the fear that he might return or find another victim, they'd finally tracked him down.
Where? I asked, reaching for the notebook I kept by my bedside to record every detail of the investigation. Birmingham, Alabama. A pawn shop owner recognized his photo from the federal wanted poster, said a man matching his description had tried to sell expensive jewelry that matched items we've been tracking as gifts to potential victims. We traced the transaction to a stolen credit card, then to a motel on the outskirts of the city.
The jewelry. Of course. Raymond's arrogance had finally caught up with him, his need to convert his trophies into cash, exposing him when careful planning might have kept him hidden indefinitely.
Is he alone?
I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The thought that he might have found another victim, another girl to terrorize and manipulate, made my stomach clench with familiar nausea.
As far as we can tell, Detective Chen replied. But Caroline, there's something else. Something you need to know before we take him into custody.
The tone of her voice made me brace for impact. After everything Raymond had put me through, after all the revelations and betrayals and moments of despair, I'd learned to recognize when adults were preparing to deliver news that would change everything.
What is it?
We found evidence. A storage unit registered under a false name, but tied to Raymond through financial records. Caroline, there are photographs, hundreds of them going back almost 20 years, and they're not just of you. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Raymond hadn't been lying about his other victims. He'd been documenting his crimes for decades, creating a photographic record of every girl he'd destroyed. The storage unit was his private museum, a temple to his own depravity that proved beyond any doubt that I was part of a pattern, not an isolated incident.
How many? I whispered. We're still cataloging everything, but it looks like at least a dozen different victims. Maybe more. Caroline, some of these girls couldn't have been more than 13 or 14 when the photos were taken.
13, 14, children who should have been worried about homework and boy band crushes, not surviving sexual assault by a trusted family member. The scope of Raymond's crimes was even more staggering than I'd imagined.
Are you going to be able to identify them?
We're working on it, Detective Chen said. But Caroline, I need you to prepare yourself for something. When this story breaks, when the media gets hold of the evidence we found, it's going to be huge. National news, probably. Raymond Harper isn't just a local predator, he's a serial offender who's been operating across state lines for decades. You're going to be at the center of one of the biggest criminal cases Georgia has seen in years. The thought of national attention, of having my story dissected and analyzed by strangers, made me want to crawl under my covers and hide. But I'd come too far to let fear stop me now.
What do you need me to do? Just be ready, Detective Chen said. And Caroline, what you did gathering that evidence, finding the courage to come forward, it's going to save lives. Remember that when things get difficult, the arrest went smoothly, too smoothly, according to the federal agents who handled the operation. Raymond surrendered without resistance when they knocked on his motel room door, as if he'd been expecting them. He was polite and cooperative during booking, answering questions with the calm demeanor of a man who'd already made peace with his circumstances. Most fugitives fight or run when we catch up with them, Agent Patricia Valdez explained during a phone call that night. They're desperate, panicked, willing to do anything to avoid capture. But your uncle acted like he was checking out of a hotel instead of being arrested for multiple felonies. It was unsettling. What does that mean for the case? It means he's planning something, Agent Valdez replied. A defense strategy, a plea bargain, maybe an attempt to implicate other people in his crimes. Men like Raymond don't go quietly unless they think they still have cards to play. Raymond's first card was revealed during his arraignment hearing, which I attended despite Dad's objections and my own terror at seeing him again. He'd hired Marcus Webb, one of Atlanta's most notorious criminal defense attorneys, a man famous for getting wealthy clients acquitted of crimes everyone knew they'd committed. Webb's opening gambit was predictably vicious. He argued that I was a mentally unstable teenager who'd fabricated sexual assault allegations to gain attention and sympathy after my mother's death. The recording, he claimed, was either doctored or obtained through illegal entrapment that would never be admissible in court. Your Honor, Webb said with practiced smoothness, my client is the victim of a disturbed young woman's elaborate fantasy. Mr. Harper is a successful businessman who made the mistake of trying to help his grieving brother's family during their time of need. His kindness has been repaid with false accusations that have destroyed his reputation and his livelihood. Listening to my rape being described as kindness and my evidence dismissed as fantasy was almost as traumatizing as the original assaults. But I forced myself to stay calm, to remember that this was just the beginning of a process that would ultimately vindicate my decision to come forward. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Morrison, who had a reputation for taking crimes against children seriously, was having none of Webb's theatrics. Mr. Webb, she said dryly, I've listened to the recording in question, and I find your characterization of it as fantasy to be both insulting and inaccurate. Your client's words speak for themselves. Raymond was denied bail and remanded to federal custody pending trial. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, he looked directly at me for the first time since his arrest. His expression was calm, almost amused, as if this entire proceeding was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. That look chilled me to the bone because I recognized it. It was the same expression he'd worn after each assault, the same calm confidence that he was untouchable, that somehow he'd find a way to win this game, even from behind bars. But I had something Raymond hadn't counted on. I'd learned to be as calculating and ruthless as he was. And I'd been planning for this moment since the day I'd decided to fight back. The trial began 3 months later, in a federal courthouse in Atlanta that was packed with reporters, victims' rights advocates, and curiosity seekers drawn by the lurid details of the case. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, flanked by Dad on one side and Jessica Martinez on the other, the two people who'd stood by me through the worst period of my life. Dad had changed dramatically in the months since the investigation began. The man who'd once avoided difficult truths was now my fiercest advocate, his own therapy having given him the strength to confront not just Raymond's crimes, but his own buried trauma. He'd even started dating again, a kind woman named Linda, who worked as a victim's advocate with the county prosecutor's office, someone who understood our family's history and somehow found the strength to love us despite the baggage we carried. Webb's opening statement was a masterpiece of misdirection and victim blaming that left me feeling nauseated and furious in equal measure. He painted Raymond as a successful businessman who'd made the mistake of trying to help his troubled niece through her grief only to be repaid with false accusations that had destroyed his reputation and his freedom. Daimai. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Webb said in his honey-smooth southern drawl, this case isn't about sexual assault, it's about manipulation. It's about a disturbed young woman who learned to use her sexuality as a weapon, who discovered that crying rape was easier than dealing with the genuine trauma of losing her mother. He walked them through his version of events with practiced ease, describing how I'd supposedly seduced Raymond into inappropriate but consensual sexual encounters, then secretly recorded our final meeting to create evidence for false assault charges. According to Webb's narrative, I was a sociopathic teenager who'd studied legal procedures and evidence collection to frame an innocent man for crimes that existed only in my imagination. Caroline Harper isn't a victim, Webb concluded, looking directly at me with theatrical sympathy. She's a perpetrator, and Raymond Harper isn't a criminal. He's the real victim in this courtroom. Ada Sarah Kim's opening statement was more subdued, but infinitely more powerful. She let the evidence speak for itself, walking the jury through a timeline of assault and manipulation that painted Raymond as exactly what he was: a serial predator who'd been victimizing children for decades. "The defendant will try to convince you that Caroline Harper is a liar," Kim said, her voice steady and professional. "But photographs don't lie. Confessions recorded on tape don't lie. And the testimony of multiple victims spanning multiple states and multiple years doesn't lie either." My testimony began on the second day of the trial and lasted for nearly 8 hours, spread across 2 days. Webb's cross-examination was brutal but ineffective, every question designed to paint me as calculating and manipulative, but ultimately serving only to highlight the trauma I'd endured and the courage I'd shown in coming forward. "Isn't it true, Miss Harper, that you researched recording devices and evidence collection procedures before making these allegations?" Webb asked, his tone suggesting that preparation was somehow evidence of dishonesty. "Yes," I replied calmly, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I researched legal procedures because I wanted to make sure my uncle couldn't hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt me. I wanted evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away." "And isn't it true that you deliberately seduced your uncle into attack activity while secretly recording him?" "No," I said firmly, looking directly at the jury as I spoke. "My uncle attacked me repeatedly over a 6-month period. The final assault, which was recorded, was not consensual in any way. I endured it because I knew it was the only way to gather evidence that would stop him from victimizing other children." Webb spent hours trying to poke holes in my testimony to find inconsistencies that might support his conspiracy theory. But the truth was consistent because it was true, and my story never wavered under his aggressive questioning. The real turning point came when the prosecution introduced the photographs from the Tennessee storage unit. Webb had tried to have them excluded as prejudicial, but Judge Morrison ruled that they were directly relevant to establishing Raymond's pattern of behavior and criminal intent. The courtroom fell silent as ADA Kim displayed image after image of Raymond's victims' girls, who were clearly underage, clearly non-consenting, clearly being sexually assaulted by a man who documented his crimes like trophies. The photographs were damning beyond any possible explanation, proof that Raymond was exactly the monster the prosecution claimed him to be. Webb's defense crumbled in the face of that evidence. He tried to argue that the photographs were planted or doctored, but forensic experts testified to their authenticity. He suggested that Raymond was being framed by a government conspiracy, but couldn't explain why federal agents would fabricate evidence against a random businessman from Atlanta. Most devastating of all was the testimony of the other victims, 4 brave young women who'd found the courage to speak their truth after years of silence. Their stories corroborated every detail of Raymond's pattern of behavior: the targeting of grieving families, the use of gifts to create false complicity, the threats and manipulation designed to ensure silence. Sarah Mitchell from Alabama, now 23, described how Raymond had assaulted her when she was 15, using the same psychological manipulation techniques he'd used on me. "He told me I was special," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "That he was teaching me things my dead mother never could. When I tried to tell my father, Uncle Raymond convinced him I was having grief-induced hallucinations." Jennifer Walsh from Tennessee, 25, had been Raymond's victim at 14. "He had photographs," she testified. "Said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure everyone in my high school saw them. I believed him. I was just a kid, I didn't know I had options." Michelle Rodriguez from Florida, now 21, had been only 13 when Raymond began abusing her. "He said it was a Harper family tradition," she said, her voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "That all the Harper men taught their daughters and nieces how to be women. I thought it was normal until I got older and realized what he'd done to me." Each testimony was like a dagger in Raymond's defense, proof that his crimes weren't isolated incidents or teenage fantasies, but part of a systematic pattern of abuse that had destroyed multiple lives across multiple states. Raymond never took the stand in his own defense, probably on Webb's advice. There was no credible way to explain the photographs, no innocent interpretation of his recorded confession, no defense strategy that could overcome the mountain of evidence against him. But I wasn't prepared for Raymond's final card, the one he'd been holding since his arrest. On the last day of testimony, just before closing arguments, Webb called a surprise witness, Dr. Patricia Reeves, a psychiatrist who claimed to have been treating Raymond for dissociative identity disorder for the past 5 years. According to her testimony, Raymond suffered from multiple personalities created by severe childhood trauma, and the personality that had committed these crimes was not his true self. Mr. Harper has no memory of the acts described in this courtroom, Dr. Reeves testified with clinical precision. The personality that perpetrated these crimes is a trauma response, a psychological defense mechanism created to cope with his own victimization as a child. Punishing him for crimes committed by this alternate personality would be like punishing someone for actions taken during a psychotic break. It was brilliant and despicable in equal measure, using Raymond's own victimization as a child to excuse his crimes as an adult, turning the cycle of abuse into a legal defense strategy. For a moment, I wondered if it might actually work, if a jury might choose sympathy over justice. But Ada Kim was ready for this gambit. During cross-examination, she methodically destroyed Dr. Reeves' credibility, revealing that the psychiatrist had been paid enormous sums by Raymond's defense team and had never actually published any peer-reviewed research on dissociative identity disorder. More importantly, Kim introduced evidence that Raymond's crimes showed clear planning and premeditation, the rented storage unit, the false identities, the systematic targeting of vulnerable family members. Multiple personality disorder doesn't explain the defendant's ability to maintain a storage unit under false names for 20 years, Kim said during her closing argument. It doesn't explain his methodical documentation of his crimes or his sophisticated manipulation of law enforcement during his months as a fugitive. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges, multiple counts of sexual assault, child pornography, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and federal racketeering charges related to his interstate criminal enterprise. Judge Morrison sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to victimize another child. As the bailiff led Raymond away in handcuffs for the final time, he looked back at me one last time. But the smug confidence was gone, now replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man who'd finally faced consequences for his crimes. He'd taught me how to be a predator, how to plan and manipulate and strike when the moment was right. Now, he was learning what happened when the student surpassed the teacher. But the real victory wasn't Raymond's conviction. It was what happened afterward, when I realized that surviving his abuse had given me something I'd never expected: the strength and knowledge to help other survivors find their own voices, their own paths to justice. The cycle of abuse that had poisoned my family for generations was finally broken. Not just by Raymond's imprisonment, but by my decision to speak the truth, to refuse to carry forward the legacy of silence and shame that had enabled predators like him for far too long. The months following Raymond's conviction passed in a strange kind of peace I hadn't experienced since before Mom's death. For the first time in over a year, I could sleep through the night without nightmares, could walk through my own house without constantly checking over my shoulder, could exist in my own skin without feeling like it belonged to someone else. Dad and I began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship, working through layers of pain and betrayal, with the help of a family therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. Our first session was awkward and stilted, both of us sitting on opposite ends of a couch that might as well have been an ocean, neither knowing how to bridge the gap that Raymond's crimes had opened between us. "I keep thinking about that night," Dad said during our third session, his voice thick with regret. "The night your mama died, when we sat in my truck and made those promises to each other. I swore I'd protect you, and then I let my own cowardice
nearly destroy you instead. You were protecting yourself? I replied, the words coming easier than I'd expected. From memories you weren't ready to face, from truths you weren't strong enough to handle. I understand that now.
Understanding doesn't make it right, he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. I chose my brother over my daughter. I chose my own comfort over your safety. How do you forgive something like that? The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. But slowly, session by session, conversation by conversation, we began to find our way back to each other. Not to the relationship we'd had before that innocence was gone forever, but to something new, something built on truth instead of comfortable lies. Dad threw himself into supporting other families dealing with similar traumas, volunteering with victims' rights organizations, and speaking openly about his own childhood abuse for the first time in his adult life. Watching him transform from a man who avoided difficult truths into someone who sought them out, who used his own pain to help others heal, was one of the most remarkable things I'd ever witnessed. He also began dating Linda Mitchell, the victim's advocate who'd worked on our case. Linda was a kind, patient woman who understood the complexities of trauma and the long road to recovery. She never tried to replace Mom or pretend that our family's history didn't matter, but she brought a gentle strength that helped us all believe in the possibility of healing. Your father is a good man who made a terrible mistake, she told me during one of our private conversations. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it also doesn't define who he is. People can change, Caroline. They can choose to do better. My relationship with Jessica Martinez slowly healed as well, though it took months of honest conversations and patient rebuilding of trust. She'd been hurt by my rejection during those dark months, confused and frustrated by my refusal to let her help. But she also understood in the way that true friends do, that sometimes people have to save themselves before they can accept help from others. I kept thinking there was something I could have done. She told me one afternoon as we sat on her front porch sharing a bottle of sweet tea and watching the sunset over the Georgia hills. Some way I could have figured out what was happening and helped you stop it. There wasn't anything you could have done, I assured her. Raymond was too good at hiding what he was, and I was too good at hiding what he was doing to me. But you being there afterward, standing by me during the trial, believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself, that meant everything. The other survivors from Raymond's storage unit photographs had all entered therapy and begun their own healing journeys. 3 of them, Sarah, Jennifer, and Michelle, stayed in touch with me, forming an informal support network that gradually expanded to include other survivors we met through various advocacy organizations. We called ourselves the Phoenix Project Survivors, who'd risen from the ashes of our trauma to help other victims find their voices and their strength. It started as weekly phone calls sharing resources and offering support during difficult moments. But it grew into something larger, more organized, more powerful than any of us had imagined. You know what I realized? Sarah told me during one of our group calls. Raymond thought he was collecting us, adding us to his private museum of broken girls. But what he actually did was create a network of survivors who understand each other in ways nobody else can. He gave us each other. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that Raymond's crimes had connected us across state lines and family boundaries, creating relationships that were helping us heal from the very trauma he'd inflicted. I graduated from high school a semester late, having to make up credits I'd missed during the darkest period of the abuse. But I walked across that stage with Dad and Linda cheering from the audience, knowing that earning my diploma was more than just an academic achievement. It was proof that I'd survived, that I'd refused to let Raymond's crimes define the limits of my future. College was a different challenge entirely. The full scholarship to UGA was long gone, but several victims' rights organizations had come together to offer me funding for my education. I chose Emory University in Atlanta, drawn by their criminology program and their reputation for supporting survivors of sexual violence. Living in Atlanta, just miles from where Raymond had operated his criminal enterprise for so many years, felt like reclaiming territory he'd tried to steal from me. Every day I spent studying criminal justice, learning about legal procedures, and victim advocacy was another day I transformed my trauma into tools that could help other survivors. But the transition wasn't easy. Dorm life, with its lack of privacy and constant social interaction, triggered anxiety I hadn't experienced since the worst days of the abuse. My roommate, a cheerful girl from Savannah named Rebecca, tried to be understanding, but how do you explain to someone that sharing a room feels like being trapped? That unexpected sounds in the night can send you into full panic mode. I ended up moving into a single room my second semester, paying extra for the privacy and safety that I needed to function. It felt like another victory, another way of choosing my own healing over what other people expected from me. The real breakthrough came during my sophomore year when I took a class on trauma-informed criminal justice with Professor David Kim himself, a survivor of childhood abuse who'd channeled his experiences into academic research and policy advocacy. Trauma doesn't make you broken, he told our class during the first lecture. It makes you different, and sometimes being different, understanding things that people who haven't experienced trauma can't understand, gives you unique strengths as well as unique vulnerabilities. That class changed my academic focus from general criminology to specialized study of sexual assault cases and victim advocacy. I started volunteering with the campus Sexual Assault Resource Center, using my own experience to help other students navigate the complex process of reporting and recovery. It was during this volunteer work that I met Dr. James Morrison, a clinical psychologist who specialized in treating trauma survivors. James was everything Raymond wasn't: gentle, patient, completely respectful of boundaries, committed to helping people heal rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully, with the kind of deliberate communication that comes from understanding how easily trust can be broken and how difficult it is to rebuild. James never pushed, never assumed, never took anything for granted. He understood that my ability to be intimate, to be vulnerable, to let another person close to me, was something that had been damaged and had to be rebuilt piece by piece. Healing isn't about forgetting what happened to you, he told me during one of our early conversations. It's about integrating those experiences into a larger story of survival and growth. It's about refusing to let trauma have the final word in defining who you are. 3 years later, we were engaged to be married, not because I'd gotten over what Raymond had done to me, but because I'd learned to build a life that was larger than his crimes, stronger than his attempts to destroy me. The wedding was scheduled for May 18th, exactly 5 years after the night I'd recorded Raymond's confession, exactly 5 years after I'd chosen to stop being a victim and start being a survivor. The date wasn't a coincidence. It was a celebration of the moment when everything changed, when a broken teenage girl decided to fight back against the monster that was trying to destroy her. But there was one more surprise waiting for me, one final revelation that would recontextualize everything I thought I understood about my family's history and my own journey toward healing. 5 years have passed since Raymond Harper was sentenced to life in prison, and I'm now 22 years old, a senior at Emory University, studying criminology with a specialization in crimes against children and victim advocacy. The full scholarship I'd lost at UGA had been replaced by something better: funding from a coalition of victims' rights organizations who wanted to support survivors who'd chosen to transform their trauma into tools for helping others. Dad and I have rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of honesty, rather than comfortable lies. He married Linda 2 years ago in a small ceremony that included me as maid of honor, both of us understanding that healing doesn't erase the past, but can transform it into something useful. At their wedding reception, Dad gave a toast that brought tears to every eye in the room. "I want to thank my daughter, Caroline," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "for having the courage I didn't have, for speaking the truth I was too afraid to face, and for teaching me that love means protecting the people you care about, not protecting yourself from uncomfortable realities." The applause that followed wasn't just for his words, it was for the journey we'd both taken, the difficult path from betrayal to forgiveness,
to something stronger than either of us had thought possible.
Jessica Martinez and I maintained our friendship through college, though she chose social work at Georgia State, while I pursued criminology at Emory. She often jokes that we both ended up in helping professions because of what happened to me, that Raymond's crimes inadvertently created two advocates instead of destroying one victim. "Maybe that's how justice really works," she said during one of our recent conversations. "Not just punishing the people who do wrong, but making sure their crimes lead to more good in the world than harm they caused." The Phoenix Project has grown from a support group of 4 survivors into a registered nonprofit organization that provides resources and advocacy for victims of familial sexual abuse across the Southeast. We've helped dozens of survivors find the courage to report their abusers, navigate the legal system, and begin their own healing journeys. Sarah Mitchell, now 28, serves as our program director in Alabama. Jennifer Walsh, 30, runs our Tennessee operations. Michelle Rodriguez, 26, coordinates our outreach efforts in Florida. Together, we've created something Raymond never could have imagined: a network of survivors who've turned his methodology of terror into a system of support and empowerment. But perhaps the most meaningful development in my life has been my relationship with James. We're planning to be married next month on May 18th, exactly 6 years after the night I gathered the evidence that brought Raymond down. The symbolism isn't lost on either of us. "I love that you chose to reclaim that date," James told me when I suggested the wedding timing. "Instead of letting it represent trauma, you're making it represent triumph. That's the most beautiful kind of healing. Our relationship has taught me that intimacy is possible after abuse, that trust can be rebuilt, that love doesn't have to be about power and control." James never pushes, never assumes, never takes my healing for granted. He understands that some days are harder than others, that anniversaries and unexpected triggers can still send me spinning backward, that recovery is an ongoing process rather than a destination. The week before our wedding, I received an unexpected letter that would change everything I thought I understood about my family's history and my own journey toward healing. The return address was from a women's correctional facility in North Carolina, and the sender was someone named Margaret Caldwell. I didn't recognize the name, but when I opened the letter, everything became clear. Margaret had been following my case in the news and recognized the Harper family name from her own childhood trauma. She was Raymond's first victim, assaulted when she was 12 years old during a family reunion in 1975, over 20 years before he'd first attacked me. "I wanted to thank you," she wrote in careful handwriting that showed her education despite her circumstances, "for having the courage to speak up when I never could. But more than that, I wanted you to know something about your uncle that might help you understand why he became what he became, and why your courage was so important in breaking a cycle that goes back much further than you realize." What followed was a revelation that shocked me to my core. Raymond hadn't started as a predator. He'd started as a victim. Margaret's letter included photocopies of documents she'd discovered while researching her own family history, police reports, medical records, and social services files that painted a picture of systematic abuse within the Harper family going back generations. Raymond's father, my grandfather, had been investigated multiple times for suspected child abuse, though charges were never filed. His father before him had been rumored to molest his daughters and nieces. "Your uncle was abused by his own father," Margaret wrote, "horribly repeatedly from the time he was very young. Your father too, though he handled it differently. It doesn't excuse what Raymond did to us, but it might explain how he learned to see children as objects instead of people. Trauma creates trauma, Caroline, until someone finds the courage to break the cycle." The letter forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, about how victims can become perpetrators, about the complex psychological mechanisms that turn wounded children into adults who wound other children. Raymond's crimes were unforgivable, but understanding their origin helped me process my own trauma in ways I hadn't expected. More importantly, Margaret's revelation gave me a new understanding of my own role in this generational saga.
I wasn't just a victim who'd fought back, I was the person who'd finally broken a cycle of abuse that had been destroying Harper women for decades, possibly longer. The most important thing you need to know, Margaret continued in her letter, is that the cycle ends with you. Not because you were braver or stronger than the rest of us, but because you lived in a time when speaking up was finally possible, when evidence could be preserved, when some people were finally willing to believe that children don't lie about being sexually assaulted. She was serving time for killing her own abusive husband, she explained, but she'd found peace in knowing that Raymond would never hurt another child, that his reign of terror had ended because one of his victims had refused to stay silent. The letter concluded with a request that broke my heart and filled it with purpose simultaneously. I'm eligible for parole in 2 years. I don't have anywhere to go, no family that will take me, no skills for surviving in a world that's changed so much since I've been locked up. Would the Phoenix Project consider helping someone like me? Someone whose story is messier than most, whose response to trauma wasn't as clean or legal as yours? Of course we would. Of course we had to. Margaret Caldwell was part of our story, part of the chain of survival that connected all of Raymond's victims across decades and state lines. Helping her transition back into the world wasn't just charity, it was completing the circle of healing that had started with my decision to fight back. Today, as I sit in my apartment near campus, finishing my final semester of undergraduate work and preparing for graduate school, I sometimes think about that 17-year-old girl who lay broken on her living room floor and decided to become a hunter instead of prey. She couldn't have imagined the life I'm living now, the love, the purpose, the sense of having transformed something terrible into something meaningful. This morning, I received my acceptance letter to the University of Georgia Law School, where I'll be starting in the fall with a full scholarship from the same foundation that funded my undergraduate education. I'll be specializing in family law and victims' rights, preparing for a career that will let me continue the work I started with the Phoenix Project on a larger scale. James and I are planning to move to Athens together after our wedding, where he'll establish a private practice specializing in trauma therapy while I pursue my law degree. We've already started planning a life together that acknowledges our individual wounds while building something stronger than either of us could create alone. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came last week when I received a letter from a 15-year-old girl in Tennessee whose uncle had been abusing her for 2 years. She'd seen a news article about the Phoenix Project and found the courage to report his crimes to local authorities. I read about what you did. She wrote, how you gathered evidence and fought back and won. It made me think that maybe I could do the same thing. Maybe I could be brave like you were. Her uncle was arrested 3 days later based on evidence she'd collected, using techniques she'd learned from reading about my case. Another predator stopped another cycle broken, another girl who refused to let trauma define the limits of her future. If there's a young woman reading this somewhere carrying her own terrible secret, wondering if she's strong enough to speak up, or if anyone will believe her, I want her to know you are stronger than you think, and your voice matters more than you know. The system isn't perfect, and the road isn't easy, but you don't have to walk it alone. And to the parents and family members who might one day hear a disclosure like mine, believe us, protect us. Choose us over reputation and comfort and the convenient fiction that monsters don't hide behind familiar faces. We need you to be brave enough to see the truth even when it's ugly, even when it hurts, even when it means acknowledging that people you love are capable of terrible things. The cycle of abuse that had plagued my family for generations ended with me, not because I was braver or stronger than the victims who came before me, but because I was lucky enough to live in a time when speaking up was possible, when evidence could be preserved, when some people were finally willing to believe that children tell the truth about being hurt by adults they trust. I survived. I fought back. I won. And now every day I work to make sure that other survivors know they can win too. Next week, James and I will stand in front of our friends and family and promise to love and support each other through whatever challenges life brings us. Dad will walk me down the aisle, Linda will cry happy tears. Jessica will be my maid of honor, and members of the Phoenix Project will be there to celebrate not just our marriage, but the life I've built from the ashes of Raymond's crimes. The wedding will take place on May 18th, 6 years to the day after I recorded the evidence that brought down a predator and began my journey from victim to survivor to advocate. It's a date that once represented the worst night of my life, now transformed into a celebration of everything good that followed. The story ends here, but the work continues. Every morning, I wake up and choose healing over bitterness, hope over despair, action over silence. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it.
Because silence protects predators, but our voices can change the world.
And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we can break cycles of harm that stretch back through generations, ensuring that the children who come after us inherit healing. Instead of trauma, strength; instead of silence, hope; instead of shame. The phoenix rises not because the fire didn't hurt, but because something inside her refused to let the flames have the final word.